pass it over to Mike to introduce our first two speakers.
What's great about this, you've got this blinding lights right here, so you can't see anything. So you have no idea how the audience is reacting. Since I'm just right now realize that I'm moderating this, I'm delighted to have you both here, Robin and Robert. I can read your names right off there, and look forward to hearing what you talk about. And I should say I'm going back to the University of Virginia in 6 months. I'm really here as a University of Virginia person. I'm glad to offer advice about the National Science Foundation, but I do not consider a touch of any proposals that have anything to do with STIR. I think it's great stuff. I've drunk the Kool-Aid, you know, so.
Okay, so thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? So I titled this Responsible Innovation in University Nanotechnology Research, Reflections on Learnings from Life in the Serengeti of Queen's University Belfast Center for Nanostructured Media. And this is truly a co-presentation I'll be doing with Dr. Robert Bowman, who Robert is the director for the Center for Nanostructured Media at Queen's University. And in this collaborative effort, I would have to say I had collaborative interactions both with the scientists as well as with the staff and Robert. And the term Serengeti was a term that he used in one of the very first discussions we had about what's happening in the laboratories. I'm trying to make sense of my interactions and my discussions with the scientist. And it carried through to this presentation, and you'll see in my analysis, the Serengeti was actually a very appropriate metaphor. So I've used it throughout the presentation, and kind of, you'll see on the left is Queens, and on the right is the Serengeti, and it sort of are both one and the same. So I want to start off first by introducing both myself and have Robert introduce himself, because I think that's part of the context that's relevant for how I looked at the interactions and how the interactions went. So I have a natural science background, a computer science bachelor's, and then I spent 20 years in industry doing technology startups, both business development as well as founding companies that were venture-backed. And one of the successes and one of the things I loved about what I was doing before is looking at patterns and what are the patterns that are happening in business, in markets, in industries. And I brought that to both my management degree of science and management, and then as a PhD candidate in looking at sort of these patterns. And as I was approaching STIR, it was what are the patterns that I'm seeing, and having the discussions with Robert, who can talk about his background.
Good morning, everyone. I guess what I should say, beginning and putting my biography there, I have a PhD in physics from University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I'm originally from one of the islands in the west of Scotland, reasonably quiet but entrepreneurial sort of environment. And I think there's an interesting sort of facet maybe that is an element or a thread that runs through much of the research I did, in the sense that where I did my PhD at University of Strathclyde was founded in the 1750s as a technical college by an escaping professor of natural philosophy from University of Glasgow, who saw the upcoming industrial revolution and the importance of teaching science and scientific art to the artisans and the tradesmen. And so the university has carried through this as its motto, a place of useful learning. And I always sort of maybe pitch that as being a thing that's stuck with me from my PhD time in doing something that's always useful. I've been at Queen's for 16, 17 years now, and at a time of change in the organisation in the mid-2000s, I became director of the research centre, which previously had been this sort of traditional departmental, societal grouping of like-minded academics. We formed then under a new management structure that I'll mention in a minute, a more formalised research centre that I've run for the best part of a decade now. I'm also involved in the university at the very highest level, advising the Vice-Chancellor or the University President on university research strategy. So I sit with a number of maybe 9 other colleagues across the university faculties, providing sort of strategic advice to the University President. And I also am involved in the UK, so like I sit on the main council of the Institute of Physics in the UK, which is akin to the APS in the US. And I guess this is relevant as well for this, that maybe this is why we've maybe meshed quite well with Robin and with this project. Unlike probably many academics, I've got an MBA. And about a decade ago, I decided to do an MBA to try and understand how our applied research actually sometimes meshed and didn't mesh with the industrial world, and to try and pick up one of the words that was used earlier on this morning, to try and learn some of the jargon of the business world so that we could actually approach and engage with them using the same language. And I ended up actually doing a research dissertation part-time as the MBA, looking at the engagement of the university with a regional innovation strategy as well. So that's my background.
Yeah, and so one of the things I think that worked, so just to let you know, so my laboratory in the U.S. was a startup company, a university spin-out. And part of the charter of doing STIR was to have an international comparative. And so Eric said to find a laboratory, an international laboratory to host me. And so I reached out. My startup was a nanomaterials company, so I knew from a scholarly work that I should try and stick in the nanomaterials area. I also knew, given what STIR was doing, that for me language was going to be an issue. So if I went to a country where English wasn't the native language, that it would be harder for me to do the STIR part of it. And that would be part of the learning. And so I wanted to isolate that. So I just Googled nanomaterials, UK. I started in the UK first as English. I looked at Australia thinking, wow, that'd be a great place to go. And I found Robert's laboratory and sent him an email with a very brief description of STIR and what the purpose of STIR was. And he responded back immediately with an interest in it. And maybe you can just talk briefly about why you were interested in participating.
I think it's probably on the slide there. You know, the background of both myself as an individual and also my colleagues, co-PIs in our centre. We sit at the interface of fundamental science and applied science, and we see a continual sort of dialogue with people outside the university sector. So a lot of the work we do isn't just purely to fellow academics. You know, we're dealing with everyone from companies, sponsors, also to involvement with policymakers and decision things, because we're a major player in our small regional thing, and also with the Ireland aspect as well. We've always been getting involved in this discussion. So there's always had that context riding in the background of the sort of day-to-day work that we do. So this seemed an interesting learning experience for us as well.
Yeah, so I think there was a connection on two different areas that that Robert and I had as well, individually, as well as the laboratory and my interests overlapped. So I think that helped to make for a successful engagement. And as we look going forward, how do we replicate this and grow this? There's some things, some dynamics there, I think, that made it work. So now Robert's going to talk a little bit about Queen's and the setting for my study.
So for those that aren't familiar with Queen's, Queen's is one of two universities in Northern Ireland. It sees itself as a research-intensive university, so it does everything from clinical medical research right through to physics, astronomy, stuff on the Hubble Space Telescope, the whole spectrum of research. It has an aggressive approach in the sense that because of its regional aspect, it sees it being a key player in developing the island and the region. And the current university president, when he came in a few years ago, set an extremely ambitious goal, which was over a sort of decade-and-a-half period to get us into the top 100 in the university. You take that with a pinch of salt, as you know, it's because it's a continually evolving landscape. But it's a stretch target, if anything. Just put out some metrics out there and then see if you can reach as hard as you can. There's about 20,000 plus students and about $500 million turnover in the university. Interestingly as well, maybe it's relevant to this thing, is it's moved away from a sort of traditional university perspective, and it has got a much more structured management system where academic staff are managed through their involvement in a research centre. And so if you're not in a research centre as a research active academic, you're almost like, to use the phrase black swan, you're a black sheep, and you're basically being circled and put at the edge of the herd. You know, you're not running with a pack. You're lame. You're not performing, and you know we don't want you. Is the sort of culture that has been evolved in the university towards meeting this really ambitious goal of actually moving forward. So there's a very sort of the university would like it to be a very rigid, formal management structure. Pragmatists like me on the ground, you know, you deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And also, it's interesting as well because we sit. Trying to make an analogy with the US, we're part of a national system in the UK where we fall into all the sort of rules and all the systems in place there, but we're also operating as devolved regions, so we're a wee bit like a state college. You know, we sort of cover quite an interesting perspective of environment, and that affects how we behave. So within our centre, the Centre for Nanostructured Media, we're effectively advanced materials, and I was going to put up some examples of what it is, but you know, it's Thursday morning and it's too tedious, not enough, too much jargon. Basically advanced materials, and as I say, it's evolved from a collegiate grouping of like-minded staff. There are 3 staff foraging at lunchtime, you know, and it's quite a recent evolution. 2 senior professors, myself and one of the other guys, and 2 assistant professors share an office now. We don't have individual offices. We're actually working together in one office, which has caused quite a bit of stir because it's part of our sort of entrepreneurial aspect. We've got about typically $6 to $8 million research portfolio. That splits probably half of it from NSF, like the National Research Council in UK, EPSRC, and then 25% EC, 25% other, so other funding agencies, industries, etc. We've always been involved in an engagement because of where we do sitting and doing applied research. There's always a look from the university to say, how are you going to involve industrial engagement? So there's always a pull from university senior management saying, yes, you must do fundamental science, but we're also looking to you, unlike the astronomers, for the industrial engagement. So you've got a double weight to carry on. And this is relevant in the sense of, in the UK, you may be familiar with the formalised research assessment exercise that takes place every 6 to 7 years. 2014, there's going to be an overt impact agenda. So something like 20 to 25% of the grades or marks that will ultimately determine funding will be on the impact of research. So there's a changing landscape. The post-crash 2008 thing with the new government has changed the funding landscape as well. There's much more emphasis on the government looking for business-university relationships. That feeds down to me on an operational level as, you know, bring in more money from industry. So slightly modify that funding breakdown, becomes a new agenda. And even down to something like the equivalent of NSF turning around and saying to you, as they've done just at the beginning of this year, we're now a sponsor, not a funder. We want you to come to us with a portfolio where we'll then participate in as a sponsor. We're not just going to give you money because you think you're great. We want to see a package put together. So there's quite a dynamic environment taking place in the UK. And then I think most recently is, and it sort of coincided with Robin coming into our laboratory, is while she was there, the students and some of the people were aware of I was spending a huge amount of time in negotiations with a major industrial client, and that the outworking of that was about 3 months after she left. There was a formal announcement of a $15 million investment by Seagate Technology in our centre to develop a major research programme. So we've completely skewed some of the research directions that we're going now. If you just take it on a cash basis, they've come in and have acted as quite a significant disruptor in our research. You know?
So I felt this is important to to give you the context for what I've observed and my analysis from STIR. So first off, just to let you know, so my engagement happened a year ago. So I was there for 4 months, and I had 4 PhD student researchers that were in Robert's laboratory. And out of the 4, 3 of them are from Northern Ireland. All 3 of them are physicists, master. They have a dual master PhD program. And I had one first year, two second year, and then the fourth person I had was a new being. He was from Taiwan, and he came over to get his PhD. So he didn't do the master's PhD route. He'd worked in industry. And this is some pictures of my setting in the laboratory with them. And I had, part of STIR said do sort of high interaction with some and low interaction with others and see the difference. I found that very hard to separate. And so I ended up having discussions, ongoing discussions with all, and not just these ones that were active in the research participation in the lab. So with that, I wanted to then step into my method of socio-technical collaboration. And going back to my metaphor, I really felt when I started, I was, sort of the Jane Goodall trying to learn the language of how a different animal is speaking, and trying to become Dr. Doolittle because there are so many languages happening in this laboratory, and how do I talk to these animals? And when I was using the STIR decision protocol, that's really what I was learning was their language and how the decisions are being discussed and the language they use. And it started actually very quickly to evolve into, and the next picture over is outside of the laboratory. The laboratory sits right on the edge of the Botanic Gardens, and the Botanic Gardens has a statue of Lord Kelvin. And Lord Kelvin is a physicist, a recognized physicist, and he's also a native of Belfast. And so the way my socio-technical collaboration happened was by talking about Kelvin now, because there's a statue out there. So let's discuss how their research fits in with the bigger context of physics and what's happening in physics. And so that started opening up the discussion point from the technical decisions they were making to where that fit into their disciplinary science. And the next picture is very early on, so I got there mid-January. So by mid-February was St. Patrick's Day. And this is a picture of me at the St. Patrick's Day parade. And one of the things that happened was, you'll see I have this really nice orange and green and white scarf on. And I went back to the laboratory after I had this, went to the parade, and I put the scarf on my cubicle with them. And one of the PhD researchers came up and said that I needed to take the scarf down. And I was like, well, why do I need to do that? And it's against university policy because you're showing favoritism to a specific sect within the culture. And so that led to a discussion about the university in society, and particularly within Northern Ireland, and where there's conflict happening, and where does their science in their university sit in their society. And so that then graduated to the far picture is a walk that you can go along on the river in Belfast. And on the side of a building, it says, "How can quantum gravity help explain the origin of the universe?" And so that led into a very good discussion with all the researchers about the role of science in society and society in science. And so it was these sort of things that that were captured and that led this collaboration to move from beyond the science to really what we're trying to do is this integration. And it was structured serendipity, I kind of call it, right? Because who would have predicted that these things were going to happen, or that the certain times, or what would spark the discussions? But it's what sparked the discussions and being able to have the discussions that led to this really collaborative effort. So what I wanted to do next was sort of do a meta-analysis of what I found in my discussions. And there were two tensions that I'm going to describe. One is the tension that I talk about, which is what's being researched. And to Renee, that's kind of your question, is what's being researched in the laboratory and how does that change? I found the tension is scientific excellence to societal relevance. And scientific excellence says that these students, these researchers in the laboratory, knew exactly what was shaping their research from a scientific excellence. They knew that the university was in a Russell group, which says it categorizes how we do research. They knew that it was a publish-or-perish mentality. They needed to publish out of their research. They knew, which was very interesting to me, the one on the left is their academic lineage. They could say, in physics, here's this person led to this person, led to this person, or, you know, sort of standing on the shoulder of giants. They knew the peer review process and the benefit of that. And they knew this research assessment exercise that said, you know, we have sort of this broader impacts that's coming up and we need to pay attention to it. When we had the discussions, what we didn't have was, and that's why on the far right, the societal relevance is grayed, it's obscured, because they knew, very similar to what Don was saying, they knew that, yeah, the societal relevance of our science is, yeah, there's economic impact, there's jobs, there's these grand challenges, yeah, potentially my science could cure cancer. But the way it was connected was, well, that's going to happen through industry. And so once my science gets into industry's hands, then industry is going to, you know, figure the rest out. And so they could see it in an abstract form, but they couldn't see it in a concrete form. And so that's sort of what I call a very overt tension. It was evident in all of our discussions. They could see this out there. They knew that they wanted to go that direction, but they didn't know how to get there. So that was the what part. The second tension I observed was more of a covert tension, and that's the how they do the research. And in this area, there's a tension between competition, so competition to get funding, competition to get my paper in a peer-reviewed journal, versus collaboration. And collaboration says, you know, I have to work in a team, I have to work with industry, I have to work with other universities. And these were coming from multiple sources, and they're all sitting in the middle because they both suggest and encourage competition and collaboration. And so the decision of how was, am I going to do this solo by myself and compete, or am I going to do this from a cooperative, collaborative? And that includes from the industry, from the European Communion, they were familiar with that, from the local, the regional InvestNI, from Queens down to even the industry, Seagate, that was working with them. So I put this into what I call tensions that are shaping laboratory for responsible innovation. And the tensions actually, the scientific excellence to societal relevance becomes a survive or thrive. So if I'm doing scientific excellence, I know I can survive. I know that this path is a path that will lead me to survival. If I do societal relevance, potentially I can thrive, right? I can create an economy in Northern Ireland that supports me and my family and generations. But that's less clear. And then on the competition side, it's more of a predator. And so if I choose either survive or thrive, am I going to do this by myself? Or am I going to be collaborative because there's a potential that I'll be a prey? And so these strategies and these decisions at sort of a higher level were in play all the time in the laboratory. So I thought the metaphor that Robert originally gave me was very accurate. And in fact, maybe you can just briefly talk about how Seagate shaped the research in your laboratory.
I give you a good example of the sort of the, you know, it's always for survival and the next meal coming along. And they had engaged with us for many years, and then we got word that they were wanting to come in at a much more significant level. And so they came in with some senior staff to have a walk around the building and talk, and we were showing them various locations or facilities that we had and how it would be relevant to the project. And we walked along the basement past this large 500 square metre, what's that, 750 square yard lab, fantastic lab, and it was locked, dormant. And they said, well, what goes on in there? And I said, oh, X, Y, Z. Oh, it's sort of under mothballs because the 3 staff are just about to retire. And they said, that's interesting. And I then just threw in the comment of just ad-libbing. But, you know, the system in the university is funded research takes priority. The implication being, if you come in with a significant enough package, that room will be cleared, and that's the footprint for your new environment. And now this is me saying this, basically removing a third of the laboratory space from under the control of one of my colleagues, as one of my fellow directors of research in my school. You know? So even within one school, we're actually looking at each other going, right, how do we get competitive advantage, you know, to secure the next contract? You know, and it's actually looking at it as probably at quite a commercial basis. You're actually applying quite a lot of value assessments on it. There's nothing about at this stage, there was nothing in there about the value of the science we're going to do with Seagate. That's a discussion that's going to come along in subsequent meetings and things. Before you can even have that discussion, you've got to get them on your side and make a value proposition. You know, and that has an impact onto other scientists. You know, so maybe that's all I'll say on that.
So I'm going to move on to sort of my look at being an integration scholar. And so part of the scholarly work to me was to say, okay, I've identified a what and a how, but now as an integration scholar, I want to know why. Why are these decisions happening? And so I went to institutional theory that says institutions matter, back to, you know, Don's how do we institutionalize this? And institutions, in the scholarly literature, they're norms, routines, common habits, established practice that guide and shape individuals' behaviors. And institutions have been studied historically, so sociology, political science, and economics have used institutions to look at behaviors. Contemporary starts to look at how, in organizations, these institutions shape behaviors of individuals in companies. And most recently in public policy, Elinor Ostrom just won the Nobel Prize for her work in how governance of the commons, so sort of the shared space, happens, and how collective action happens among individuals who have seemingly different and various interests. And finally, there's a whole series of literature on how institutions matter in innovation, both innovation systems from a federal level, from a regional level. Institutional environments has been studied by Hollingsworth, and he says that these institutions don't always necessarily work together. They do work in tensions, and they are competing. And finally, relevant to a university, there's the triple helix, which says these institutions of university, industry, and government work together, sometimes cooperatively and sometimes competing, to influence these behaviors. And so I started looking at institutions and saying, how do institutions matter in responsible innovation? And that's sort of the unknown unknowns that I'm going to do for my own dissertation. And I came up from my work with Queen's with an analytical framework that I'm going to now apply to, as Robert said, Queen's, the Center for Nanostructured Media, looks very much like a state college, not a top tier, but one who's in the top tier and wants to become, you know, they're in the top 10 and they want to become in the top 5. And so I can identify similar universities that have that same structure and look at how institutional influences differ, how the government institutional influences are different, how the industry institutional influences are shaping it. And I've identified they come through two sources. They come through kind of academic peers, which we're all familiar with from the academic side, but they're coming through societal peers outside. And that's really where I think the interest is, if you project out bigger term for responsible innovation, is who are these societal peers that are shaping responsible innovation today, and how can we expand that out? That's where I'm taking the learnings from STIR from a scholarly perspective. My other laboratory, as I mentioned, was a nanomaterial startup, and so they kind of fit in the industry bucket, but they're a university spin-out. So this framework is also relevant for me to look at, and I think it's useful to look at industry applications for STIR. So if we branch out from federal laboratories, private laboratories to industry, I think it becomes a useful framework to look at what's shaping responsible innovation. And I think with that, I'll open it up for questions or concluding thoughts. I would like Robert to talk just a little bit about the context of the culture within the laboratory and the PhD students that I was working with, and perhaps some reflections on that.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of interesting dynamic in terms of listening to, I identified listening to a lot of the discussion yesterday with the issue of being, when we announced that Robin was coming and doing this, there was the whole thing of everyone looking at themselves as being the observed. And, you know, this person coming into the environment and perhaps uncovering, you know, to the PIs, hidden secrets of, you know, exploitation or, you know, our sort of aggressive entrepreneurial approaches to things. And I don't think, you know, I think that was largely unfounded. I think it was just uncertainty at change. What was interesting was some of the comments when she came to speak to me after we'd sort of introductions. She just had free rein to just wander around and speak to anyone as she chose, and interacted at lunchtimes, coffees. There was no real sort of formal structure or timetable put in place. And I think one of the things she sort of picked up quite early was how flat our structure appeared to be and how informal it was. You know, to the extent that I think in one of the discussions she had with a Taiwanese student, he found this cultural shift really difficult to handle. The fact that the professors all just called each other by, you know, Christian names, and they wanted just to be called by first names by the students, and they would overtly tell students after 3 or 4, you know, gentle reminders, stop addressing me as Professor so-and-so, call me Robert, you know, or Marty or whatever, and that there was no real sort of hierarchical structure in the centre, and that it perhaps sat more almost, and, you know, I characterise this as my own sort of view in it in terms of when I try and characterise what we do in the wider university framework. We're a group of 5 or 6 PIs. We run a business of £8 to 10 million or dollars. We've got 30 odd people within a sort of a framework of a university, but it's really an SME, is my sort of view as a leader of the activity. And it wouldn't help in that small organisation to have lots of layers and hierarchy in there and people with distinct roles, because we all rely on and this is the interesting thing, she says that, you know, there's a societal thing on the outside. We actually see ourselves as a mini society internal, as a team of people being interdependent. And in the same way, I can't afford as an individual to put money in my bank every month to cover the prospects of facing brain surgery or some life-debilitating disease, but as a society and a health service we can do that. In the same way, I as an individual can't afford to run on my own all the facility I need to do research as an individual PI, but with 5 or 6 like-minded individuals with a similar mindset and direction, we can afford to do it as a sort of mini society. So there's an interesting dynamic in there that actually the group of the people is more of a society than the sort of environment that we actually exist in. And we go out then and hunt as a pack, you know. Maybe that's all I'll say.
Process question. We've got enough time for the second part of the plenary, and then 5 minutes question total. That's if we're going to fill the break and go right into Mike's talk. So I don't know if we want to take 2.5 minutes of questions or save 5 minutes at the end for both presenters.
Let's see if anybody wants to ask a question here, these folks. I think fair enough. We've got one back there. We'll
I
try
wonder
to-
if you could say a few more words about the students' orientation. In particular, since nanotech is kind of in the middle, as you pointed out, some of the students might be interested in going to talks on quantum Hall effect and atomic trapping. Some of them might be interested in going to talks on what you can do with nano circuits. You know, why Intel will want to make nano memories and the like. What kind, can you put the students on a your 4 students on a continuum in terms of their interest, or did you just go to the talks in the group? And also for Robert, can you say a few words about the IP, how IP is handled at your school, and how the Seagate, whether it makes any difference? Do you guys have a Birch Bayh-Dole thing, or what?
I think the students are all pretty much as a unit. They're not covering fundamental through to really applied. They're all fairly similar in the project activities that they're actually doing. How they go about them, I think, is slightly different, depending, and I think, and this is largely on their intellectual and motivational drive.
Right. I was going to say, one of the reasons I had put this on a timeline was because my time with them was actually also their own progression in the PhD program and in their learning of science. And so I felt like, again, it wasn't structured that way initially, but as we're having the discussions, it's also relevant to what they're learning about their own sort of scientific endeavor and where they fit in the bigger scheme of science. They were all just working on their thesis, yeah.
We'll take one more over there.
Yeah, I'm Ottavio Bassetti from the Bassetti Foundation, who has been our mission is to foster responsible innovation. We are a tiny foundation, but I had an observation for Robin. There are these giant foundations that are coming in, like the Gates Foundation, the OEDR network. I live in San Francisco, so I'm seeing, and they come from the technology environment, the innovation environment. So I was wondering, are you going to consider that in your ecosystem of your thesis?
Yeah, a very good
Okay.
question. In fact, the other Robin, who has the exact same spelling as my name, which is awesome. So this framework, the triple helix, doesn't capture this sort of societal element really well. You'll see that there's a small section right here, but she actually suggested that there is maybe a 4th helix, that it should be a quadruple helix, and there's literature out there to support it, which I need to look at, that says, yeah, that these there is a societal component besides just citizens that are shaping these behaviors, and that their foundations, their organizations, their if you think about environmental, their funding and shaping the direction of research. So yeah, I probably need to add that in there. Yeah.
Thank you.